I was halfway through my morning coffee when the call came in. The voice on the other end was tense, clipped. Inspector Laurent, we've had a breach at the Diamond Center. You need to get here immediately. Brussels was cold that February morning, the kind of cold that seeps into your bones. As I hurried through the narrow streets of the city's Diamond District, I saw the flashing blue lights from a block away. Officers stood outside the massive steel doors of the Antwerp Diamond Center, their breath rising in white clouds. The air was thick with a metallic tang of fear. Inside, chaos. Bank officials were pale, whispering frantically in small clusters. A vault technician sat on the floor, his face buried in his hands. The head of security approached me, his voice shaking. Inspector, they're gone. Everything's gone. I stepped past him into the vault room. I had been here before, thick concrete walls, triple lock doors, magnetic sensors, cameras. The most secure vault in the world, or so they claimed. Now, dozens of safe deposit boxes hung open like broken jaws. Velvet pouches lay empty on the floor. Gold. Diamonds. Jewels worth over $100 million. All vanished. And yet, there was no sign of forced entry. I walked slowly around the room, careful not to disturb anything. It was wrong. Every heist I'd ever seen left a trail, broken locks, cut wires, brute force. But here? It was as if the thieves had been invited in. The security footage should have been my first step, except when I asked for it, the head of security gave me a blank stare. The cameras in the vault, they didn't record. All the tapes are blank. I asked why, but deep down I already suspected the truth. Someone knew how to make the cameras blind. The vault itself was a masterpiece of engineering. 2 steel doors, each with a different key, a 100 million volt magnetic field to trigger alarms, heat sensors, motion detectors. To reach it, you had to pass through a manned security checkpoint and 2 separate locking gates. And yet, the thieves had bypassed every single layer. I crouched beside an open box, gloved hands sifting through the debris. Small flecks of white clung to the velvet, styrofoam. That was strange. Styrofoam wasn't stored in the vault. The strangest thing, though, was the smell. Not metal, not dust, something sweeter, like almond oil. The almond scent triggered a memory from my early days in the force, a case involving a master lockpicker who used certain lubricants to silence metal-on-metal friction. It meant one thing. This wasn't an inside job by a low-level employee. We were dealing with professionals. Professionals who had planned this for months. And as I would soon discover, one of them had been walking the streets of Antwerp under a false name, in plain sight. The first real lead came from an unassuming neighbor. She lived across the street from the Diamond Center and told one of my officers about a quiet Italian man she often saw on her balcony. He spent hours staring down at the street, jotting notes in a little black book. We traced the apartment lease. It was under the name Leonardo Notarbartolo, a name I recognized. Notarbartolo had a reputation stretching from Milan to Turin. A convicted jewel thief. A man who could open a safe faster than most people could unlock their front door. I pulled his file. It read like a manual for the perfect heist. Suspected in dozens of robberies across Europe. Known to work with a tight-knit crew of specialists. Fluent in several languages. No convictions in the last decade, because no one could prove anything. When we raided his rented flat, we found a strange collection. Detailed sketches of the Diamond Center's layout. Photographs of the vault door. A miniature replica of one of the key locks. Half-eaten sandwiches still sitting on the kitchen counter, as if he'd left in a hurry. The refrigerator held something else, small plastic bottles filled with a clear liquid. Lab analysis later confirmed it was the same almond-scented lubricant I had smelled in the vault. I leaned back in my chair that night, staring at the evidence board. We had motive. We had preparation. But the one thing we didn't have was the diamonds. If Notarbartolo had taken them, where had he hidden them? And why was there still no sign of a break-in? I didn't know it yet, but we were chasing a phantom trail, one he had left for us on purpose. I asked why, but deep down I already suspected the truth. Someone knew how to make the cameras blind. The vault itself was a masterpiece of engineering. 2 steel doors, each with a different key, a 100 million volt magnetic field to trigger alarms, heat sensors, motion detectors. To reach it, you had to pass through a manned security checkpoint and 2 separate locking gates. And yet, the thieves had bypassed every single layer. I crouched beside an open box, gloved hands sifting through the debris. Small flecks of white clung to the velvet, styrofoam. That was strange. Styrofoam wasn't stored in the vault. The strangest thing, though, was the smell. Not metal, not dust, something sweeter, like almond oil. The almond scent triggered a memory from my early days in the force, a case involving a master lockpicker who used certain lubricants to silence metal-on-metal friction. It meant one thing. This wasn't an inside job by a low-level employee. We were dealing with professionals. Professionals who had planned this for months. And as I would soon discover, one of them had been walking the streets of Antwerp under a false name, in plain sight. The deeper we dug into Notar Bartolo's contacts, the stranger the story became. He was no lone wolf. He had a crew, each one a specialist. And one of them was a man I'd only heard about in whispers, the Ghost Maker. His real name was never confirmed, but he had a skill that made him worth his weight in gold. He could kill security systems without leaving a trace. No burnt wires, no cut lines. Just darkness. If the cameras in the Diamond Center vault had gone blind, it was almost certainly his work. Through intercepted phone calls and surveillance, we pieced together a lineup. The King of Keys, Notar Bartolo himself, mastermind and safe expert. The Ghost Maker, electronics and security systems. The Monster, a man of brute strength, rumored to have once carried a safe on his back. Speedy, the getaway driver, with nerves of steel and a tendency to panic. The Genius, a locksmith who could duplicate a key from a single photograph. It was like something out of a heist film, except this was no fantasy. These men had been meeting in cafes, parking garages, and warehouses in Antwerp for 2 years before the heist. We also discovered something chilling. 6 months before the robbery, Notar Bartolo had rented an office in the Diamond Center itself, posing as a diamond dealer. From there, he had legitimate access to the building, the elevators, the corridors, and perhaps even the vault's antechamber. Still, there was one puzzle that gnawed at me. If they had been so careful, why had they left behind tiny traces, styrofoam bits, a few footprints, the smell of oil? It didn't feel like carelessness. It felt like a message. The crew had vanished into thin air. But one of them, the weak link, was about to crack wide open. It was almost laughable, the way the break came. After months of high-tech trickery and flawless execution, our first real evidence came from a dumpster. 2 days after the heist, a park ranger reported strange garbage dumped deep in the Ardennes forest. It looked like someone had driven out at night and thrown away bags of shredded paper, tape, food wrappers, and one crumpled envelope from the Diamond Center. When our forensic team went through it, we found empty jewel bags with serial numbers matching those reported stolen, burnout light bulbs from motion sensors, plastic bottles with traces of the same almond-scented oil, and tucked into a sandwich wrapper, a single receipt from a grocery store. The receipt was the mistake. It was dated just hours after the heist, purchased with a credit card belonging to a man named Pietro Tavano. We knew that name. It was Speedy. We tracked Tavano to his apartment. When we arrived, he looked like he hadn't slept in days. There were bags half-packed by the door, a half-eaten plate of pasta on the table. The man was sweating bullets before we even said a word. "I didn't do anything," he blurted out. "It wasn't my idea." We didn't have the diamonds, but we had him. And if Speedy was anything like the rumors said, it wouldn't take much to make him talk. I remember leaning in across the interrogation table, watching his eyes dart back and forth. Finally, he whispered, "We buried them. But you'll never find where." At the time, I thought he was bluffing. I was wrong. Speedy was sweating so much that the table beneath his arms glistened. At first, he rambled about how he didn't even want to be there that night, how he was just the driver. But as the hours passed and the silence stretched, the truth began to spill. They hadn't blasted their way in. They had walked in. Months earlier, Notarbartolo's office in the Diamond Center had given him an ID badge. That badge got them through the main security doors without raising alarms. From there, the ghost maker went to work. Using a custom-built device, he bypassed the magnetic field sensor on the vault door, tricking it into thinking it was still locked. The monster then removed the internal security panel with surgical precision, disabling heat and motion detectors. Once inside the vault antechamber, they faced the final obstacle, the key lock. That was where the genius came in. A year before the heist, Notarbartolo had briefly borrowed the real vault key from a corrupt security guard, snapping high-resolution photos of it. The genius used those images to create a perfect replica. At 11:15 p.m., on the night of the heist, they opened the vault door without a single alarm going off. Over the next several hours, they broke into 123 safe deposit boxes, using aluminum to silence the sound of drills, and styrofoam to keep boxes from clattering when removed. By dawn, they had filled duffel bags with gold, diamonds, and cash. They walked out the same way they came in, locking the vault behind them, leaving no sign of forced entry. As Speedy spoke, I couldn't help but feel a grudging respect for the sheer precision. It was perfect. Almost. The only reason we even had Speedy in custody was because, in his panic afterward, he dumped evidence carelessly. And his panic was only going to get worse, because Notarbartolo, his so-called friend, had already vanished. Tracking Notarbartolo wasn't easy. By the time Speedy was in custody, the mastermind had slipped out of Antwerp, leaving behind nothing but a bare apartment and an unpaid utility bill. We traced his movements through ATM cameras, border logs, and phone pings, until finally, we found him in a quiet suburb outside Turin, Italy. When we arrived, he was sitting on a cafe terrace, sipping espresso as if he didn't have a care in the world. No diamonds in sight. No sign of fear. I sat across from him, while the Italian police hovered nearby. He smiled, a slow, deliberate smile. "Inspector Laurent," he said in flawless French, "I was wondering when you'd come." I laid the evidence on the table between us. Photographs, fingerprints from his office, and Speedy's statement. Notarbartolo didn't flinch. "You've got stories," he said. "But where's your proof? You can't convict a man on fairy tales." He was right, for now. But when we searched his home later that day, we found several incriminating items. A key identical to the one used on the vault. Surveillance photos of Diamond Center staff. A detailed timeline of the building's night routines. And in the garage, a bag containing $100,000 in mixed currency. Still, there was no trace of the diamonds. Notarbartolo insisted he was just a middleman, hired to case the building but not to take part in the actual theft. I didn't buy it. He had the confidence of a man who knew the truth would never be found in a courtroom. And deep down, I feared he might be right. The ghost maker was different from the others. Not a thug, not a flashy criminal. He was an engineer, the kind who treated alarm systems like crossword puzzles. In fact, before turning to crime, he'd reportedly built security systems for luxury banks in Switzerland. That made him dangerous in a way I didn't like to admit. If he didn't want to be found, he could make himself invisible. Our break came through a single phone tap. An intercepted call from a disposable phone, a man speaking Dutch with a faint Eastern European accent. The voice analysis matched one of our suspects, Chris Z., a Belgian electronics expert with ties to Italian gangs. Following him was like chasing smoke. He never took the same route twice. He walked under scaffolding, behind buses, through open-air markets, always avoiding security cameras. Even when we thought we had him cornered, he'd slip into a crowd and vanish. But one thing betrayed him: human needs. Even ghosts have to eat. We finally caught him when he stopped at a small convenience store on the outskirts of Antwerp. The shop's CCTV was ancient, a grainy black and white feed, but it was enough to confirm him. We moved in fast. When we arrested him, he had a backpack with tools, wires, and a laptop that could control multiple wireless frequencies. On his hard drive? Blueprints of the Diamond Center's security layout, annotated, modified, perfected. The Ghostmaker didn't say a word during interrogation. Not one. He just sat there, staring at me like I was the puzzle, and he'd already solved it. Without his cooperation, our case was still missing the one thing that mattered. The diamonds. And every day that passed, I knew they were getting further from Antwerp, and closer to disappearing forever. It was Speedy again who gave us the lead. Under pressure, he admitted that after the heist, the crew had driven to a remote farmhouse deep in the Belgian countryside. It belonged to a friend of a friend, the kind of place no one asked too many questions about. We moved in quietly, sending 2 unmarked cars down the muddy track that led to the property. From the outside it looked abandoned, cracked shutters, weeds clawing at the walls, a rusted tractor in the field. But inside, it was a different story. The kitchen table was covered in half-burned maps, coffee-stained plans, and scraps of paper with safe deposit box numbers scribbled on them. In one corner, there were heavy-duty duffel bags, the same kind used in the heist, now empty except for stray velvet pouches and a few loose gold coins. The most chilling find was in the basement. There, stacked neatly against the wall, were dozens of plastic buckets filled with dirt. At first we thought it was garbage, but then we realized. This was the soil from wherever they had buried the diamonds. They had dug them up, moved them, and taken the loot somewhere else entirely. We were standing in the ghost of a crime scene, one step behind, always. Still, the farmhouse gave us something we hadn't had before: DNA. Hair strands, cigarette butts, a few fingerprints on the maps. It tied the crew together in one place, proving collaboration. But as I stood in that damp, dim basement, I knew we were still far from the finish line. The diamonds weren't here. And if they'd already been smuggled out of Belgium, our odds of recovering them were shrinking by the hour. What I didn't know then was that the trail would lead me far beyond Belgium, into a chase across borders, into Italy, and straight into enemy territory. Following the farmhouse lead, we traced several phone calls made in the days after the heist. Most were dead ends, burner phones, disconnected lines, but one stood out. It connected to a small diamond dealer in Turin, Italy. A dealer with no official business license, and a history of laundering stolen jewels. I flew to Turin under the guise of a routine visit to collaborate with Italian authorities. In truth, I wanted to see the man myself. The shop was tucked into a narrow street, its windows dusty, the doorbell broken. Inside, the air smelled of old wood and metal polish. The owner, a wiry man with darting eyes, recognized me for what I was before I even spoke. "Belgian police," he muttered. "You've come a long way for nothing." He denied knowing Nota Bartolo. Denied knowing anything about Antwerp. But on a shelf behind the counter, half hidden under a newspaper, I spotted a velvet pouch, the kind the Diamond Center used for its smaller stones. When I left the shop, the air outside felt thicker. I walked 3 blocks before I realized I was being followed. A man in a dark jacket, keeping pace, never closer than 20 meters. He wasn't a tourist, and he wasn't subtle. That night, I moved to a different hotel under an alias. But the feeling of being watched never left. Every time I looked over my shoulder, I caught a shadow moving just out of sight. Turin wasn't Antwerp. Here, Nota Bartolo's connections ran deep. If I pushed too hard, I risked walking straight into a trap. Still, I couldn't turn back. I was close, closer than I'd ever been, to finding where the diamonds had gone. It was a tip from an Italian informant that broke the stalemate. He claimed Nota Bartolo had used an abandoned vineyard outside Turin as a meeting place after the heist. Sometimes, trucks arrived late at night, leaving before sunrise. The informant swore he'd once seen men unloading heavy crates into the old wine cellar. We went in quietly, no sirens, no marked cars. The property looked like it hadn't produced a single grape in decades. We slipped through a rusted gate, boots crunching over frost. The main house was empty, but in the cellar, we found fresh footprints in the dust, 3 distinct sets. Against the far wall sat 6 large wooden barrels. My heart pounded as we pried the lid off the first one. Inside, nothing but dirt. But the second barrel was different. When we cracked it open, a faint glint caught the light, a small bag of uncut stones. It wasn't the full haul, maybe a few €100,000 worth, but it proved the diamonds had been here. Which meant the rest might still be nearby. And then everything went wrong. A sound, tires on gravel. Shouts in Italian. Whoever owned the vineyard had returned, and they weren't alone. Through the narrow cellar windows, I saw 3 men with flashlights and something worse, the glint of metal in their hands. We were outnumbered, deep in their territory. Our radios crackled as we called for backup, but help was miles away. I had a decision to make: confront them now and risk everything, or slip away into the night and hope they didn't know what we'd found. We chose to slip away. In the darkness of that vineyard, we backed out through the cellar's side passage, climbing a slope covered in dead vines until we reached the tree line. The men never saw us. By the time backup arrived, the vineyard was silent again, our quarry gone, the barrels gone, and the cellar scrubbed clean. We never found those men. And the truth is, we never recovered more than a fraction of the loot, just the small bag of stones from that night. The rest, nearly $100 million worth of gold, cash, and diamonds, simply vanished. We charged Notarbartolo with theft and conspiracy, and he went to prison. Speedy, the monster, and the ghost maker followed. But without the diamonds as evidence, the sentences were lighter than we'd hoped. And when Notarbartolo was released years later, he walked out smiling, as if he knew something we didn't. Some say the diamonds were buried again, in a place only the crew knows. Others whisper they were smuggled to Dubai or Israel, broken down into smaller stones that could never be traced. For me, the case never truly ended. Every time I walk through Antwerp's diamond district, I catch myself glancing at the shop windows, wondering if one of those glittering stones once lay in the vault I swore was impenetrable. We solved the crime. We caught the thieves. But the diamonds, they're still out there. And that is the cruel truth of it. Sometimes, in this line of work, justice means finding the culprits, but never the treasure.